Hello and welcome. In this video we're going to learn about Stripe Elements, which is a set of pre-built UI components that allows us to securely collect payment method details like credit or debit card details from the front end and send them to the back end for further process. There are several UI elements that Stripe offers, but in this video we're going to focus on the card details. The main reason why we should use these Stripe elements is to ensure secure customer-server communications and also PCI compliance. Our server should never receive or store card data at all. So we must send everything directly to Stripe from the front end and only handle tokens or IDs on our server. If you want to read more about PCI compliance and security payment integration, you can visit docs.stripe.com/security/guide. So let's check what we're going to learn on this video. We're going to start with the card element, which is a single input that contains the card number, expiration date, CVC, and the zip code. We're going to create a payment method and send this new payment method ID to the backend, where we can attach to a customer or create a payment intent to receive payments. Next, we're going to create individual elements for the card number, expiration date, and CVC, so we can style the inputs according to our needs. On the front end, we're going to use pure vanilla JavaScript, and on the back end, to save the card details or charge our customer, we're going to use Node.js. So before we get our hands on coding, first thing you need to do is to create a Stripe account if you don't have one yet, by visiting the official Stripe website, which is stripe.com, and click on the sign in button on the top right, and then click on create account on the bottom. It will show a form so you can enter your personal details, and once you're done you can click on create account. Since I already have an account, I'll click on sign in and I'll log with one of my personal accounts here. Okay, click on sign in. And this is the Stripe dashboard. As you can see on the top left, we are in test mode. That means all payments we receive, it's going to be fake, just so we can test and make sure everything is working before going to production. And below the test mode label, we have a drop down here showing all our accounts. And as you can see, Stripe already creates one by default so we can use, which is called new business. But we can change the name by clicking on edit. And on the input, we can enter whatever name we like. For example, the name of a project or a business. So in my case, I'll add manfra.io and click on save. Great, so we are using on test mode the manfra.io account, and we can create other accounts here by clicking on create new account. And to connect our application we're going to build using this account, we need some API keys. And to get these API keys, we can click on the developers option here on the top and select the API keys tab. And we have two different keys. The publishable key, which we'll use on the front end to generate the Stripe elements and other functionalities so we can send to the backend. The publishable key can be publicly accessible in a web or mobile application client side. We don't need to store this securely. And then we have the secret key, which we'll use on the back end, and it must be secret and stored securely in the server side. We cannot expose this secret key. We'll be back on this page to grab both these keys during our application development so we can get started on coding. I'll be using VS Code for the tutorial, but feel free to use any other code editor you like. I have an empty folder open on VS Code called Stripe Elements Example. It's an empty folder because we're going to create everything from scratch. So I'll start by opening the terminal here on the top. So we can start our node project by typing npm init, and I'll add the -y flag to use the defaults instead of asking some typical questions like name of the project, version, and if there is a repository and other details. So hit enter. Okay, project created, and we have a new package JSON file here that contains information about our application, and we can change these details if we need. Now let's install the dependencies we'll be using. So back on the terminal, I'll type npm install, and we're going to use Express to organize the routes of our application and some other functionalities that we'll see during the tutorial. And the Stripe original module, and .env to store our Stripe secret key securely. Okay, dependency is installed, and we can check here inside our package.json file under the dependencies object. Still inside the package.json file, we have a main property here pointing to an index.js file. So we need to create this file in the root of our application, and it's going to be our main file. So let's create this file here on the root, new file, index.js. And inside this file, I'm just gonna paste some lines of code here because in every video in the channel, I just keep repeating myself when creating a basic Express server. Okay, so here on the top, we are initializing the .env module to use our environment variables. So we need to create a .env file also on the root. We'll create soon. And here we are importing Express module and then initializing Express inside a constant called app. Next, we're configuring Express to accept JSON data from the client. Next, we're configuring a middleware in Express to serve static files inside a folder called public. And we're also going to create this folder soon on the root. So everything inside the public folder will be accessible on the browser, like HTML, CSS, JavaScript, and image files, for example. Next, we're creating a basic route, which is like a home route that we're sending to the client, an index.html file that we're going to create soon inside the public folder. And we're also configuring the root property using the __ name environment variable, which returns the absolute path where the index.js file is. And last, we're telling Express to listen on port 3000, and if everything works, we should see the message service started on port 3000 when running the server. And before running the server, let's create on the root the files and folders that we're gonna need. So let's start with the .env file to configure our Stripe secret key. So new file, called .env. And inside this file, let's create an environment variable called Stripe _secret _key, which is equals to, let's go back to the Stripe dashboard to grab the secret key here. So click on review task key, and we can click on top to copy. Great, now back on the code, let's paste the secret key we just copied. Great, so that's all for the .env file. Now back here on the root of our application, let's create the public folder to store the static files we'll be using on the front end. So new folder, called public, and of course we can configure and give any name to this folder, and we can also create and configure in Express multiple folders to serve static files. And inside the public folder, let's create the index.html file we're sending to the client when accessing the home route. So new file, called index.html. And inside this file, if you're using VS Code, you can type HTML and select this HTML:5 option here. That VS Code will create a basic HTML structure for us. So let's change the title here to Stripe Elements, for example. And inside the body tag, let's add a h1 element, also with the Stripe Elements title, just so we can test. Okay, let's run our server and see if everything's working. So let me open the terminal again and let me clear. And let's run the index.js file by typing node index.js or just index and hit enter. Great, it shows server started on port 3000 on the console. Now let's try to access the home route to see if it's returning the index.html file we just created. So back on the browser, I'll open a new tab here and type the localhost and port 3000. And great, here's the index.html file with the title and the h1 element. So everything is working for now, and we can start creating the Stripe elements on the front end. And we're going to create the elements inside the index.html file using a div tag. And inside a JavaScript file, we're going to call the Stripe API, informing which div belongs to which Stripe elements. So here inside the public folder, let's create a new file called script.js. And let's add this new JavaScript file inside our index.html file. So here inside the body tag, on the bottom, I'll add a script tag. and the source property is equals to the scripts.js. Okay, now let me remove this h1 element from here, and let's add a div element, which will be the card element that we're going to create inside the scripts.js file. And I'll add an ID attribute here, and we can call this div card-element. Let me just add a label element on top of this div, and the for attribute will point to the card-element div. That means when we click on this label, it will focus on the div element. And inside we'll add credit or debit card. Now, if we test this, let me refresh, it will just show the label and an empty div on the page. So we need to tell Stripe to attach the card element inside this div here. So for that, we need to include the Stripe.js script also here on the index.html file. So I'll add above the scripts.js script tag here because we're going to use the Stripe inside the scripts.js. So I'll add another script tag here, and the source property is going to point to https://js.stripe.com/v3/. Awesome. Now inside the scripts.js file, let's import and initialize Stripe by adding a const called Stripe equals to Stripe class in capital because we're creating an instance of the Stripe object. And inside the parentheses here, we need to pass the publishable key. So back on the Stripe dashboard, let's copy the publishable key by clicking on top and paste inside the Stripe class here. Now we need to create an elements instance. So below here, I'll add a new const called elements equals to the Stripe constant dot elements method. Great. So let's create a card element and attach to the card-element div we have inside the index.html file. So I'll create a new const called card element equals to the elements constant dot create method, and inside we need to add the type of the element we're creating. In this case is the card type. Now we need to attach the card element we just created on the card-element div. So I'll call the card element dot mount method, and inside we need to add the DOM element that we want to attach. And here it accepts either a CSS selector or an actual DOM element. So we're going to include the card element div we created here. So we can add the hash to get the element by the ID, and then card-element. Great. Now let's check on the browser, open the tab we were using and refresh here. And there it is. We have the label here on the top and the card element div where we can add the card number. So for example, I'll add 4242 for all digits. And it has the card brand icon here on the beginning. And if we jump to the next field, which is the expiration date, it already has some validations here. So if we add a date lower than the current date, for example, January 20, it will change the color to red, informing it's invalid. And we also have the CVC input and the zip code input as well. Let's just add some styles here because the content of the card element is too spread out. So back on VS Code, let's add a CSS file inside the public folder. So new file. And we'll call this styles.css. Okay, now let's add the CSS file inside the index.html file. So above the title tag here, I'll add a link tag with the real attribute equals to style sheet, and the href attribute equals to the styles.css file we just created. And still here on the index.html file, let me wrap the label and the card element div inside a div element. So let me cut from here and paste inside the div. And I'll add a class attribute here with the card_box class. Now here on the style CSS file, I'll import the font we're going to use from Google Fonts. And this is the Montserrat font we're going to use. Great. And I'll start adding some styles for the card_box class. And I'll add a display property equals to flex. And the flex direction equals to column. The width equals to 40%. Let's add a margin auto to center the entire div horizontally. The font family equals to the Montserrat font we just imported, comma sans serif. And let's add a font size for all elements inside of 14 pixels. Okay, now back on the index HTML file, let me add a class attribute here on the card element div so we can style as well, and we'll call this card_input. Now back on the style CSS file, let's add the card_input class, and let's add a width of 100%, and then the box sizing property equals to border box, and then a border with a light gray color, solid of 1 pixel, and a border radius of 6 pixels, a color property to change the color of the elements inside with a darker gray, a padding of 8 pixels. Let's add a margin top of 2 pixels to add some space between the label and the div. And let's also add a margin bottom of 14 pixels because soon we're going to create other elements as well. And a outline equals to none. And the font family equals to inherit from the card box div. Great. Let's check on the browser. Let me refresh. And awesome, it looks a lot better. Note that Stripe added this autofill link button here on the card element. Link is another payment method that Stripe offers besides the card method. We can disable this payment method on the Stripe dashboard by clicking on the settings button here on the top right, and then select the settings again and select the payments option on the bottom. Then click on the payment methods tab. And here are all the payment methods Stripe offers. As you can see, the card method is active, and let's leave like this. And if we scroll down, we have some other methods here like Apple Pay, Google Pay, but on the card element, it only shows the link payment method. So we can disable by clicking on top and then click on turn off. It will show this warning message here informing that it's an important payment method, but for our example, we can disable by clicking on turn off again. And perfect, link is disabled. Now let's check on our projects tab and refresh. And there it is, the link button is not showing anymore. Now note that the font family inside the card element div is using a different font comparing to the label on the top. And when we type something, the color is also not the same as the label. That's because we need to add the styles when creating a Stripe element inside the scripts.js file. So here on the create method, we can pass a second parameter, which is an object that we can configure some properties here. For example, the style property, which is an object as well. And we can add some variants here. For example, the base variant, which all other variants we add here, it will inherit from this base variant. So for example, let's change the color of the input text to #555, for example. And you can check the complete list of properties and variants we can pass on the style object by visiting docs.stripe.com/js/appendix/style. And here are all the variants we can pass, like when the element has valid input or invalid input, for example. And we can also configure some pseudo classes or pseudo elements as well. And if you scroll down, you can see all the properties we can configure. Great, let me close this tab. So here on the styles object, let's add the font family property, which is equals to the Montserrat font we imported from Google Fonts, comma, the sans serif font. Just like we added here on the card box class styles. But if we check on the browser, let me refresh. and you can see that the font didn't change. That's because we need to tell Stripe to get the font from the same URL we imported here on the styles.css. So let me copy this entire URL here, and back on the scripts.js file. When we're instantiating the Stripe elements here, we can pass an object as a parameter and add the fonts property, which is equals to an array of objects. And inside the object, we can configure the CSS source property, which is equals to the Google font URL we just copied. Great, so back on the browser, let me refresh, and there it is. It changes the font family to the Montserrat, which is the font we're using. And also the color inside the input to the darker gray we're using. Okay, now back on the index.html file, let's add a button below the card element so we can send the card details ID or token to the backend and proceed from there. So I'll add a button element, and I'll add an ID attribute equals to card-button. And the content, I'll add save card, for example. Now let me add a div above the button here to show a success or an error message, just to give a feedback to the user to show what's going on. And I'll add an ID attribute equals to card-result, for example. Now let's add some styles for the card button. So on the styles CSS file, I'll add hash card-button element, and I'll add a width of 100%, a background color property with a green color, so hash 7DC885, for example. And let's add a border as well of the same green color, solid of 2 pixels. And a border radius of 6 pixels. The color of the text to white. And let's add a margin top of 8 pixels to add some space between the button and the card result div. And a padding of 8 pixels for the content inside. And the font family, let's inherit from the parent div the font size of 14 pixels. And let's add a font weight equals to 500. And last, let's change the cursor to pointer. Great. Now I'll just add an effect when we move the cursor over the button. So hash card-button and the hover pseudo class. And I'll just change the opacity property to 0.8, just a simple effect, okay? And let's add some styles for the hash card-result element as well. So I'll change the color of the text to hash 444 and the font weight to bold. Great. Let's check on the browser. Let me refresh. And great. Here's the button. Now let's create a payment method using the Stripe module when we click on this button. Passing the card details, we'll enter here on the card element and then send it the ID of that new card payment method to the backend. Okay, so on the scripts.js file, let's get the button by its ID. So const card button equals to document.get element by ID and the ID of the button, so card-button. And let's also get the card result div we created above the button, so const card result equals to document.get element by ID, and the ID is card-result. Now let's add a click event for the card button, so card button dot add event listener, the click event, and a arrow function. So first let's add a loading message to the card result element just to show a feedback to the user. So card result dot text content equals to loading, like this. Now let's create a payment method using the Stripe module. So const, and I'll add an empty object here for now, equals to await the Stripe module dot create payment method. And since we're using await here, we need to add async in front of the callback function. And from the create payment method, we're going to extract the payment method, which is an object containing the payment method details, and also the error object in case something wrong happens. Now, inside the create payment method, let's configure some properties inside an object. And the first property is the type. In this case is a card. And then the card property, which is the Stripe card element. So card element, which we created here on the top. Now let's add some validation here, checking if there is an error returned. So if, then we'll check if the error object from up here contains information. And if it does, let's show on the card result div. So dot text content equals to the error object dot message. And an else statement, if there isn't an error, let's send the payment method ID to the backend so we can attach to a customer or create a payment intent. So I'll add a constant here called response equals to await. And let's use the JavaScript fetch API. And let me add a URL here called /save-card, for example. And we're going to create this route soon on the index.js file. And let's add some properties here inside an object. So the method of this endpoint will be post. And since we're going to send JSON data, so I'll add the headers property equals to an object with the content dash type equals to application / JSON. And then the body property containing the details will send. So we need to send as a string. So I'll convert to string using JSON.stringify and an object inside. And we need to send a property with the new payment method ID we created. So payment method ID equals to the payment method we're extracting up here dot ID. Now let's get the JSON data from this response result here. So const data equals to await the response constant dot JSON method. And we'll probably send a message response from this endpoint we'll create. So I'll call the card result element dot text content equals to data from here dot message. So as a response, we'll send a message property. Now let's create this safeguard route here on the index.js file. So I'll create a new route here below the home route. So app dot, and this will be a post route. And the name is /save-card. And let's add a sync here. The request and response parameters, arrow function. And inside, let's add a try block and a catch block with an error parameter. Okay, so let's say we want to save the card details and attach to our customers or users, so later when they purchase something on our store, they can choose which card they want to use for the payment. To do so, we need to create an instance of our customer on Stripe as well. It's really up to you when you're going to create a customer on Stripe platform. So when we create a customer on Stripe, it's going to return a customer ID generated by Stripe, which is unique for each customer. Make sure to store that Stripe customer ID as well on your database inside your users table, for example. Now let's assume one of our customers on our database is already logged into our application and wants to add a credit or debit card to its wallet. So let's create this customer on Stripe platform first inside the save card route, and then we're going to attach the card details. First thing we need to do is to import the Stripe module here on the top, and I'll import below the Express import. So const Stripe equals to require Stripe. And to initialize Stripe, just like we did on the scripts.js file on the front end, we need to add inside parentheses the Stripe key. But this time it's the Stripe secret key that we saved on the .env file. So let me copy the name of the variable here and back on the index.js file. To grab the content from the .env file, we need to add process, .env, and the name of the variable which we just copied. Great. Now back on the save card route, inside the try block, we'll create a new customer on Stripe. Let me add a comment here, create customer. So I'll create a new constant called customer equals to await the Stripe module we just imported, .customers, .create method. And inside we can pass some properties inside an object, like the name. So I'll add John Doe, for example. And the email, I'll just add a random email here, like jd@domain.com. And we can add a payment underscore method, which is the payment method ID we are sending here from the scripts.js file on the body property. So to grab the content from the request body, we need to call the request parameter from the route here, .body, .payment method ID. Okay, let's print on the console the customer constant to see what will return. So console.log, the customer object. And let's return a response to the client with a message, because that's what we're expecting on the scripts.js file to show inside the card result div. So response dot, let's return a status code of 201, which means created, and also a JSON response, and inside an object with the message, and I'll add something like card saved successfully. Okay, and inside the catch block, if something goes wrong, let's also return a response. So response dot status of 500, which means internal server error, and a JSON response. And inside an object, we'll also set the message property with the error object parameter from here, dot message. Great, before we test, since we made changes on the backend file, which is the index.js file, we need to restart our server. So let me open the terminal, and every time we change something on the files that are not on the public folder, we need to stop the server by pressing Ctrl+C and start again by typing node index command. To avoid this, I'll use a module called nodemon, which will listen for changes inside our project every time we save the file. You can install nodemon globally by typing npm install nodemon and a flag -g, which means global, and hit enter. I already have nodemon installed, so in that case I'll just run the server by typing nodemon and hit enter. And there it is, nodemon is running the server and listening for changes on our project. Now we can test, so back on the browser, let me just refresh here. So for the card number, we can add 4242 for all digits. That Stripe will handle this as a success payment. And any date here, as long as it's greater than the current date, so I'll add January 25. And any number for the CVC, so I'll add 123. And for the zip code, I'll add 92000. Okay, click on Save Card. It shows loading here on the card result div. And now card saved successfully. Great, let's check on the terminal. Here's the customer object returned by Stripe. And make sure to save this customer ID here on your database inside your users or customers table. And also make sure to save the payment method ID here and relate to the customer ID. Now let's check on the Stripe dashboard. And let's click on the customers option here on the left. And here's the John Doe customer we just created. And if we click, we can see the payment methods for this customer. In this case, there is just the card, which is the one we added. Awesome. Now, if we go back to the customers list, you can see we didn't set the payment we created as default. To do so, when creating the customer, we can add another property here called invoice underscore settings, and this is equals to an object, and inside we can set the default underscore payment underscore method property, which expects the payment method ID we want to set as default. So we can copy the same payment method ID from here and paste inside here. Great. To test again, let me change the name of the customer here to Jane Smith, for example, and the email to js@domain.com, just so we can test with a new customer. So let's test again, back on the browser. I'll open the tab we were using. As you can see, we didn't clear the values here inside the card element after submitting the payment method ID. So let's do that when we get a success response from the server. So below here, if there's no error, let's call the card element dot clear method. Okay, let's test. I'll refresh here. And for the card number, we can also add 55 for all digits. And for the last 4 digits, we can add 4. Stripe will also handle this as a success payment. And January 25 for the date, 123 for the CVC, and 92000 for the zip code. Click on Save Card. Okay, loading. Great, card saved successfully, and you can see that the card element was cleared. Now let's check on the Stripe dashboard. Let me refresh here the customers page. And there it is, the Jane Smith customer, and now we set the payment method we created as default. Great. Now let's say we want to add a card to an existing customer. So let's say John Doe wants to add another card to his list. So back on the code, on the index.js file, let me comment the customer creation here. Okay, and we can get rid of this console log. And I'll add a comment here if customer already exists. And we can call await directly here, then the Stripe module dot payment methods in camel case dot attach method. And the first parameter here is the payment method ID, which we can get it from the request dot body dot payment method ID. And the second parameter is an object, and we can set the customer property, which is the Stripe customer ID that you saved it on your database. And just for testing, let me open the John Doe details here, and we can copy the John Doe's ID here on the right by clicking on top, okay, and paste inside the object here. Great. Let's test again. So I'll open the tab we were using, and let me refresh. So here on the card number, let's add another success card here. So 6011, and then 1 for the next digits, and 7 on the last digit. Okay, and all these card numbers I'm using for testing, you can check on docs.stripe.com/testing. Then January 25 for the expiry date, 123 for the CVC, and 92000 for the zip code. Click on Save Card. Great. Now let's check on the Stripe dashboard. So let me refresh the John's page here. And there it is, the new card we just added. Awesome. Now, to set this new card as a default payment for the customer, in that case, we need to update the customer. So let me add a comment here saying set card as default. Then we can add await the Stripe module dot customers dot update. And the first parameter is the customer ID. So let me copy John Doe's ID that we use up here and paste. And the second parameter is an object with the details we want to update. So we can actually copy the invoice settings from the customer creation here on the top and paste inside the object here. So we are setting the current payment method ID we are creating and attaching to the customer as default. Let's just make sure it's working. So back on the browser, let me refresh. For the card number, I'll add another testing number, which is 3782-822-463-10005. And January 25, 123, and 92000. Click on Save Card. Great, let's check on the Stripe dashboard. Let me refresh John Doe's page here. And there it is. We created a new card and set as default. Awesome. So we just learned how to create a payment method using the card Stripe element and attach to a customer on the backend. Now, instead of saving a card, we can also create a payment intent to collect payments from our customers. So on the index.js file, let me comment all the code we have here. Actually, let's create a new route below here to receive a payment. So app.post, and let's call this route /payment, the async, request and response parameters, arrow function, the try, and the catch blocks, and the error parameter inside. And inside the catch block, let me copy the error response from the save card route up here and paste here. Okay. Now inside the try block, let's say we want to collect a payment using the card payment method we are creating. So let me add a comment here, create payment, and I'll add a constant called payment intent equals to await the Stripe module dot payment intent dot create method, and inside an object we can configure a few parameters here. So we can add the amount property, which is how much we are receiving from the customers, and here we need to add in cents. So let's say we're charging $20 from the customer, so we need to add 2,000 cents or 20 times 100 to convert it to cents. Next, we need to set the currency property. In our case, we'll use US dollars. And then the payment underscore method underscore types property, which is equals to an array of payment method types that this payment intent is allowed to use. So I'll just add the card here. And next, the payment underscore method, which is the ID of the payment method, and we can grab it from the request.body.payment method ID. And let's configure the confirm property and set to true. That means we're attempting to confirm this payment intent immediately. And since we set this to true, we can also set another property called error underscore on underscore required underscore action. And also set to true. And we can use this property for simpler integrations that don't handle customer actions, like saving cards without authentication. We can only set this property if we also set the confirm property to true. Great. Now we can also set the customer property, which is the Stripe ID of the customer. But since we are receiving the payment method ID of a new card, so let's leave without the customer property so we can see what happens. And of course, if we set the customer property, make sure to set a payment method ID that belongs to the customer we're setting. Great. Let's just add a console.log here with the payment intent object to see the result. And let me copy the success response from the save card route and paste here. But let me change the message here to payment successfully. Now on the scripts.js file, inside the fetch API, let's change the URL here to /payment, which is the one we just created. And the rest looks fine for now. And on the index.html file, let's change the button content here to pay $20. Okay, back on the browser. Before we test, let's remove all the customers we created and start from fresh. So let me select both customers here and click on delete customers. Okay, let me refresh here. Great, customer is deleted and our Stripe dashboard is clear. Now let me open the tab we were using and refresh here. Okay, looks good. So let's enter the card details. I'll put 4242 for all card number digits and any date here for the expiration and for the CVC as well, and 92000 for the zip code. Okay, click on pay $20. And we got an error here. Let me check. Oh, it's error on requires action, not required. So let's change on the index.js file. Requires. Okay, let's try again. So I'll just add the same details from before. Okay, click on pay $20. And great, payment successfully. Now let's check on the terminal. Let me scroll to the bottom. So here's the entire payment intent object in case, for example, you want to save the payment intent ID on your database as well to control a payment history. And let's check on the Stripe dashboard. So to see the payments, we can click on the payments option here on the left. And here it is, the payment we just received in the amount of $20. And the payment method is the card we entered on the Stripe card element. And since we didn't add a description, Stripe added the payment intent ID here. And the customer is blank because we also didn't add any customers here. Awesome. Now let's make a few changes here on the index.html file. So instead of adding a card element containing all card details, we can actually break the card details in different elements. So we can create a div just for the card number, another div for the expiration date, and another div for the CVC. So let me copy the card element div and the label and paste down here. And I'll comment the first element here. And here on the div, I'll change the ID to the card-number-element. And I'll point the label here to the card-number div. And the label content, I'll change it to card number. And I'll paste another label and div here. So this div will be the card-expire element. And the label pointing to this div. And the label content, I'll add expired date. And I'll paste another label and div again. And this one is for the card-CvC. And change the label for attribute as well. And the content to CVC. Okay, and the rest we can leave as it is. Now on the scripts.js file, let me copy the card element constant here and the mount method as well. Comment this and paste down here. And this constant now is the card number element. And inside the elements create method, instead of the card, we're going to create the card number element. So here I'll add card number element. And we're going to mount to the card-number element div. Let's paste again. And now it's the card-expire element. And we'll create here the cardExpiry element. And cardExpiry element mount to the card-expire element div. Paste one more time. And now it's the cardCvc element. And we're going to create a cardCvc element. And CVC here again. Mount to the card-CvC element div. Perfect. Now here inside the button click event, inside the create payment method on the card property, we can pass just the card number element that Stripe will automatically grab the expiry date and also the CVC from inside the elements instance here. So we just need to pass one of the three elements we created. And for now everything looks good, but soon we'll make more changes here. So let's test. Back on the browser, open the tab we were using, refresh, and there it is, the three inputs we created, but something is wrong here on the CVC input. Let me check on the code again. Oh, it's CVC, but only the first C in uppercase. Okay, let's try again. So let me refresh here. Okay, perfect. So on the card number input, I'll add 5 for the first digits and 4 for the last 4 digits. And for the expiry date, I'll put January 25. And for the CVC input, I'll add 1, 2, 3. Okay, click on pay $20. Great, payment successfully. Let's check on the Stripe dashboard. I'll refresh the payments here. And perfect, here's the new payment, also of $20 with the card details we entered. Awesome, but note that we didn't clear the inputs here. So let's do that right now, back on the scripts.js file. When we receive a response from the server, let's change the card element.clear to cardNumber element and add the cardExpiry element.clear and the cardCvc element.clear. Great. And on the index HTML file, let's say we don't want to create a customers on the Stripe dashboard because we're just receiving payments and not attaching any card to a customer. But we might still want to save the customer details on the payment method so we can have at least some minimal details of the customer. So let's create some inputs here that it doesn't exist on Stripe elements. For example, the customer full name, which we can call cardholder name, the email of the customer, and also it's a good practice to pass the zip code when creating a payment method and payment intent. You don't have to pass depending on the country you are and the currency type you're receiving. Since we're using US dollars for the example, I'm gonna add an input for the zip code as well, just to ensure that our transaction is completed securely. So I'll add the cardholder name input above the card divs here. So I'll add a new input element and I'll leave the type as text and add an ID attribute equals to cardholder dash name. And I'll also add a class attribute and we can pass here the card underscore input class that we pass on the card divs as well. And above the input, I'll add a label element and the for attribute, I'll point to the cardholder dash name and the content, I'll add cardholder name. Okay, let me copy the label and the input and paste. And the input ID now is the cardholder dash email. And the type, I'll change it to email. And the label for attribute will point to the cardholder email. And the content, I'll just add email. Now paste the label and input again below the cardCvc element. And the input ID, I'll put cardholder-zip. And point the label to the cardholder zip. And I'll just put zip code on the content. Great. Now on the scripts.js file, let's grab the 3 inputs we created. So above the card button constant, I'll add another constant called cardholder name equals to document dot get element by ID, and inside the cardholder dash name input. And I'll add another const for the cardholder email equals to document dot get element by ID, and inside the cardholder dash email input. And one last const for the cardholder zip code equals to document dot get element by ID, and inside the cardholder dash zip input. Now inside the create payment method here, we can pass the details of these 3 inputs inside the billing underscore details property, and we can add an object with the name property equals to the cardholder name input dot value, and we can set the email property equals to the cardholder email input dot value, and for the zip code we need to add the address property, which is equals to an object with the address details, but we only need to pass the postal underscore code, which is equals to the cardholder zip input dot value. Great. Now let's clear these inputs when we receive a response from the server. So below here, I'll call the cardholder name input. And since this is not a Stripe element, so we can add the dot value equals to an empty string. And same for the cardholder email, dot value equals to an empty string. And then for the cardholder zip, dot value equals to an empty string as well. Awesome. Let's test all this. So back on the browser, let's refresh. And great. Here are the 3 inputs we added. So for the cardholder name, I'll just put my name here, for example. In the email, I'll just add bm@domain.com. The card number, I'll add 60 and then 1 for all digits. And the last digit is 7. And the expire date to January 25. And 123 for the CVC. And for the zip code, I'll put 92000. Okay, click on pay $20. Great, payment successfully and clear the fields as well. Now let's open the Stripe dashboard and refresh the payments page. And perfect. Here's the new payment of $20, the card we just informed, and now we also have the customer here. So let me open this payment details, and we have a customer as a guest, but if we scroll down, we can see the customer details here, such as the name, email, and the zip code as well. And if we click on the customer options, Stripe created the customers as a guest here. This first one here is from the test we did it without informing the customer on the payment intent. Great! Now back here on our example, on the card number, if we start typing, you can see that the card brand icon is not showing anywhere. That's because we need to handle this on our own since we're splitting the card fields. Stripe does handle the validation. For example, if we type some wrong card number here, as you can see, it changes the color to red. And same here on the expiry date field, I'll type a date that is lower than the current date. And we can change the styles of the fields in its invalid state by adding some styles here on the elements create method. But about the branding icon, fortunately Stripe actually sends us the brand type when we start typing the card number. For example, we can listen for changes on the card number element input. So here on the end of the scripts.js file, I'll call the card number element. And we can listen for Stripe events by adding .on method. And the first parameter is the type of the event. So here we're going to use the change event. You can find the complete list of events by visiting docs.stripe.com/js/element/event. And the second parameter is the callback function, return an event object parameter. So inside the callback function, we can add a console.log and show the event object. Let's test this to see what it returns. So back on the browser, let me refresh here. And I'll open the console here on the browser. Let me clear first. And when we start typing the card number, it prints the event on the console. Let me expand here. And as you can see, we have some important properties here that we can use. But the one we need for now is the brand property here. And it shows Visa. So we can add some logic on our code to check the event brand type and show an icon according to the brand. So back on the code, we can find card brand icons in multiple websites. I already have a set of PNG images here that I'm just gonna paste inside our project, and you can grab these images on the GitHub link of the project on the video description. I'll paste this images folder inside the public folder so we can access from the browser. Great, so I renamed all the images according to the brand names Stripe will return to us. As you can see, there is a unknown.png here. So if Stripe doesn't recognize the card brand by the number we added, it will return unknown. So first, let's add some styles to the card number element div to show the icon on the right end of the div. So on the style CSS file, I'll call the hash card -number -element, and I'll add a background image property equals to a URL, and inside we can show a default image here, and we can grab it from the images folder, and let's use the unknown.png image here. And then the background repeat equals to no repeat. The background position equals to right center. The background size of 24 pixels, for example. And the background origin equals to content box. Great. Now on the scripts.js file, inside the callback function of the onChange event, let me get rid of this console log here. And let's change the background image property of the cardNumber element div according to the event brand. So document.get element by ID, the card-number-element, .style .background image equals to, and here I'll add backticks, the URL method, and inside the images folder slash, now I'll add $sign and curly braces, and since the images have the same name as the event brand type returned, so we can call the event.brand, and on the end here .png. Great. Let's check this on the browser. Let me close the developer tools here and refresh. Great, as you can see, here's the unknown image on the cardNumber element. And when we start typing, for example, 4242, it changes to the Visa icon. Let's try another brand, for example, 6011. Great, it looks a little small here, but you can style any way you prefer by increasing the size. Let's try another one. Awesome. And if we type an invalid card number, it shows the unknown image here. You can add different images if you like, one for an invalid card number and another for the default icon. Okay, great. We just saw how easy it is to add the card brand icon inside the card number element. Now let's change some styles here to make this page a little better. So for example, let's add an icon for the CVC element div as well. So back on the code. If you notice, there's a CVC PNG image here on the images folder. Let's show this image on the CVC element div. So here on the style CSS file, I'll just copy the styles here for the card number element and paste. And I'll change to card-cvc element. And inside here, I'll just change the background image property and replace the unknown to cvc.png. Okay, let's check on the browser, refresh, and there it is. Now for the expiry date, CVC, and zip code fields, we can actually add on the same line because these are all small fields. So here on the index HTML file, let me add a new div element here and add a class property with a card_row class name, for example, which we're gonna add some style soon. And let me select the label and divs for all three fields here, expiry date, CVC, and zip code, cut, and paste inside the card row div. Okay, now let's add some styles here on the style CSS file. So I'll call the card_row class, and let's add a display property equals to flex, and the flex direction property equals to row, the justify content equals to space between, and let's add a gap property of 10 pixels to add some margin between the three fields. Okay, let's check on the browser. Let me refresh. Okay, so for the label to be on the top of the input, we actually need to add the label and the inputs inside a div. That flex box will automatically add the label on top. So let me quick wrap these three fields inside a div here. Okay, let's check again, refresh. Okay, but now we need to set the elements as 100% of the width. So back on the style CSS, I'll call the card_row class, and I'll add the greater than sign and the div element to only select the divs inside the card role class. And I'll add the width property of 100%. Great, let's check, refresh, and perfect. As you can see, it looks a lot better like this for the user. Great, so we saw in this video how to create card fields using Stripe elements. We saw how to create a card element with all the details inside one input, and we also learned how to split the card details into separate fields. We also learned how to style the elements and listen for events, and on the back end we learned how to create a customer on Stripe, attach a card to a customer, set a default card for payments, and create a payment intent using the card details to collect payments. You can check the GitHub link for this complete project on the description below. Hope this video was helpful to you, and if it was, please click on the like button and subscribe to the channel so we can continue making more videos like this. Thank you so much for watching and hope to see you on the next video.